You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there.
Hey everyone, I'm Rod Roddenberry, and you're listening to Trek FM.
Are you taking all these books? I thought I'd take some light reading. Guess I got bored.
Well, hello and welcome to TFM's local books and comic show for Star Trek. And I'm just one of the hosts, Matthew Rushing, and so excited, coming at me all the way from the ocean, in the middle of the ocean, on an island, the one and only Casey Pettitt. That's how dedicated he is, folks.
Yes, I go a quarter way around the world and I'm still here. Yes, I am recording from sunny, windy Maui. And I think the only other time I've recorded not from home was when we did our first Contact making of book. I think it was in Vermont. So I just travel far and wide for this.
That's fantastic. Well, we're excited to be here today as we are going to be talking to Derek Tyler Attico about his autobiography of Benjamin Sisko, by none other than Jake Sisko, with him as editor. But before we dive into that, we've got some news items here. We've got a couple comics to talk about. But before we even get to that, we want to thank everybody for listening. We really appreciate it. And we do hope that wherever you are listening, you're subscribed, and that way you'll get all of the episodes of Literary Treks as soon as we get them out to you. You'll get them as soon as they drop. You can also interact with us and share us with your friends on social media. We're on Twitter or X at TrekFM. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/TrekFM. We're on Instagram at TrekFM. You, of course, find the listeners-only discussion group called the Babel Conference as we discuss things with listeners from all over the world. So you can join that. And you can also find us at Trek.fm as well online. You can also help us out with Patreon. Patreon is a way to be able to support the network and make sure that the shows that we're doing keep coming to you. You've got wonderful associate producers there over on Patreon for Literary Treks, Casey Pettitt as well as Greg Rosier, and we do really appreciate them supporting us. So go over to patreon.com/TrekFM and you too can become part of the team and make sure that all this wonderful content keeps coming to you. So with all that said, Casey, we got a couple of comics today before we dive into our feature. And one of them is Defiant number 9, which is no longer kind of a transitionary issue coming off of the Day of Blood. This is really digging into this next mission of this Defiant crew, which very unique mission for a crew of the Defiant in the first place.
Yeah, this is really when we're starting to get into this story, and even then, I feel like we're still kind of building up to something big, because we get, in the last issue, we were kind of teased with some of the characters we're going to start bringing back, and this issue really is the first one, and, it's got a really cool cover on it. You can see the Worf with his bat'leth there, and you can see a reflection of Hugh in the bat'leth, and it was just kind of fun to see Hugh back again, he really fits in this story, I think, and I'm really curious to see where he's going to go, because he's kind of just another misfit. He's kind of a misfit Borg, just like we've got some kind of misfit crew on the Defiant here. And so, not a tremendous amount happens, but we do get, we get a little bit of action, with some returning technology from the original series, but it's not so much a transition anymore, but it's an interesting way to start the new little mini series here.
Yeah, this one feels like, the foundational issue really, as we kick off this new mission for the Defiant of being basically Starfleet's bounty hunters of their most wanted. And of course, as you mentioned, the first one they're going after is Hugh, and the reason they're interested in him is because of his ability to disconnect from the Borg collective, and it's something that, of course, is very interesting to Starfleet and them wanting to study. And so, and like you mentioned as well, we end with him as a character kind of joining the Defiant. And so, now we have 6. And that's a really interesting thing. And then on top of that, kind of what they've been utilizing, this character that shows up from the original series and how they've been using that in their mission to free more people from the Borg. Very interesting. And so, again, like you said, there's some action, and I think there's also some allusions to even things coming down the pipeline, of course, with the supernova that'll be happening relatively soon, it seems like, from Spock's preoccupation for Romulus, and all of those type of things. So this really does, again, it just kind of feels like a foundational episode and or issue, really, for the arc that we're going to be on here for it. I'm guessing now this would be the first part, so maybe the next 4 issues then. And so and just kind of setting with a stage of where this series might go. One of the things that I was thinking, though, as I was reading this, it just made me wonder a little bit how long the series The Defiant might last in general, because it doesn't feel like a series you could do indefinitely.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, because it's, I don't know, a lot of Starfleet characters, and then now we've got our Orion character, but now we're bringing on Hugh and a whole new cast of characters, really. But having quote unquote stolen the Defiant, although they are technically working for Starfleet here, but it's kind of that plausible deniability on the part of Starfleet for they're almost like a rogue Section 31. It's like Section 31.5 or something. And
I love that.
It's just a little bit more legit than Section 31, maybe, but yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of different stories they could do with this, but I think it won't take very long before I think it kind of gets old and they start having to do some very different things, or spinning off something else completely, or just reabsorbing it back into the ongoing series.
Well, and it just, the whole thrust of the series, it's something that Worf talks to Spock about, was just the idea of, basically he would long for, Starfleet to give him the Defiant legitimately, as its captain. And so it almost feels like that's the end game here of, Worf kind of paying his dues in this to earn a captaincy. So I could see that being where this ends up. Also, too, I mean, just this can't seem to run indefinitely when you have characters like a B'Elanna Torres here, and split away from her husband and her child for too long. That seems to get a little bit, silly to me. So the next issue we have is Picard's Academy, Part 2, or Issue 2. And I'm really interested to hear, your thoughts on this, because neither of us was too enamored with the first issue, and I wonder if this did anything to alleviate that for you, if it just kind of continued to be somewhat of the same.
Yeah, I really hate to say it, but this is not really hitting much of a stride for me. It's an interesting concept, but I feel like the character Picard in this series is not even who we think we would have known from the series, like just from the bits that we got in the episode Tapestry. And even there's clearly some connection here to Star Trek Picard, but I mean, I don't know, some of the ways like his father's portrayed, they kind of like don't really talk about his mom, which I guess you could say kind of fits, but I don't know. It's just very loosely held to the show that it seems to be based on, and he seems so out of character. And even Spock is heavily featured in this one, and even him, I feel like I see what they were trying to do with him in this issue, but it just, I don't know. I really hate to say it, but it's really not working for me.
I have a question for you. I mean, so if I'm remembering my Next Generation history, they don't actually meet until unification.
That's a good point that I hadn't thought of. Well, I don't know, because he did say in the episode Sarek that he was at Spock's wedding. Or, well, he says, your son's wedding. We all assume it's Spock, but...
Okay. Yeah, I could not remember.
Yeah, I guess I don't remember unification that well.
I just couldn't remember if they had met or not at that point. And so it kind of seemed a little bit, strange for them to cross paths here. But like you said, if that was the case, then most likely, you're not talking about Sybok at that point. And so, because Sybok's dead. And yeah, I mean, I couldn't disagree with anything you said, though. It does just kind of feel like a very strange series. It feels like a strange character to kind of be doing this almost, I don't know, it just feels so modern, and it just is, like you said, it's just not working for me either. I just don't find myself enjoying it, and I think the idea of discussing Picard as a cadet and at Starfleet Academy is really interesting. I just wish that there was a way for this to kind of just seem like it jives better with Star Trek, as well as the character of Picard. So, unfortunately, it just doesn't feel like the case. But, Casey, I feel like I hear an orb ringing. So maybe it's time we head over to our feature and catch up with Derek.
Sounds good.
Both you and I, on the other side of the page, have been so excited about having Derek Tyler Attico on the show, because we've been so excited about this book coming out, the autobiography of Benjamin Sisko. And so, Derek, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, Matthew and Casey. I really appreciate it. Autobiography of Benjamin Sisko. No, really, it's a pleasure being here. I'm really excited to talk to both of you, and thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. So, okay, just so everybody knows too, we have both read the book, and we're going to spoil everything. So if you haven't read the book, you need to make sure to do that, because there are actually spoilers right at the beginning of the book.
Yeah.
So there wasn't really a way to do this, no spoilers. So, speaking of that, Derek, the framing device of this book, talk about using that, because I think everybody's question kind of coming into this, how are we going to handle Sisko now that he's ascended to the Celestial Temple?
That's a great question, Matthew. And I think, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was the framing device that may have gotten me the gig. I have been thinking about, well, when I had been reading the autobiography line by Titan Books, which is just a phenomenal line, right? I mean, they're written so well. I started with Catherine Janeway's by Una McCormick, and then I went back and was reading. I'm like, oh man, these are good. How would I ever do a Sisko book if I ever got it? Because that's never going to happen. But if it ever happened, how would I get a Sisko book? And lo and behold, it came down the pike, and George Sanderson, managing editor of Titan, we had a meeting. They had read my Deep Space Nine Sisko Benny Russell story for the 50th anniversary of Star Trek, and when they brought back Strange New Worlds, they liked that, and they thought I would be a good fit for the Sisko autobiography. But the question was, how do you bring him back, right? And I said, well, you know, initially George had the idea, and I guess not necessarily also George, but Titan had the idea of doing it through Jake writing his novel Anselm, which he writes in canon, which is like an autobiography of Jake, but also we could do where it's an autobiography of Ben as well. And I think that's a great idea, just for the record. I think it's a great idea. I think at some point someone should do that. But all the other autobiographies were captains in their voices, you know? And I was like, you know, there's a way for us to do it where it's still Ben speaking, it's still Ben's voice, where we still get Ben. And so I said, you know, he can still speak to us through and from the wormhole. He can still do that because he's now part prophet, you know, so we can do that. And, you know, he just has to send something to Jake. And the big crux of, and what really excited me of this autobiography is that for me, it's not so much an autobiography as it is a father just talking to his son. And in doing that, and in telling his life, it becomes an autobiography for all of us to read. But, you know, my focus the whole time was, it's not so much an autobiography. It's a man telling, you know, and a father talking about his life to his kid because he can't be with his kid right now. So he's trying to impart his life and through his life messages to his kid, you know, and in doing that, you talk about your life. That's the autobiography, you know? And so then I was like, well, how am I going to do that? And then it was like, well, you know, I'm really fluent in Trek what they call technobabble. And I was like, yeah, it has to be tachyon beam and all that. And, you know, and then that was exciting, hopefully an exciting opening. And the last three people we saw on the last episode of Deep Space Nine was we saw Kira, and Nog walked into what was now her office, talking to her. And then she walks the station and she's with Jake. So the last three people we see on Deep Space Nine. And I wanted that to be the first three people that we meet in the book to, you know, even not necessarily consciously, but to kind of bridge that, you know? So we start with Nog and then we go to Kira and then it's Jake writing that intro. So
I think that's the thing that really struck me and why this immediately felt like it fit within Deep Space Nine is because, you know, Deep Space Nine is so much a story about a father and a son, you know, and Avery made sure of that. You know, he was very keen for that to be the case. You know, of course, Sirach was as much his son as could be, and the way that he treated him and the relationship they had. And so by continuing that, it felt right.
Yeah. I thought a lot about, you know, I mean, there were a lot of different ideas I had, and you know, and I was like, oh, I could do it this way, I could do it that way, but I was like, you know, it's got to be about a father and a son at its core. Everything else is trimming, you know. Everything else is. I mean, that's how I felt. Because that's what that's what I cared about. I think ultimately that's what the Star Trek fan and the reader would care about. And I wanted the book to be. I intentionally wrote it so that someone that didn't have a huge familiarity with Star Trek or Deep Space Nine could come to it also, because I'm aware that, you know, a lot of people, I've interviewed a lot of people for Trek magazine. I've been around Trek a long time. Sometimes we watch Trek as kids and we don't come back to it until we're full-grown adults, you know? So with that in mind, you know, a lot of this, you don't necessarily have to know every little detail about, you know, you don't have to know every little detail, but all you have to do is understand relationships and people, you know, and that will carry you through, you know, or hopefully, you know, carry you through, you know.
And a huge portion of this was about, I mean, obviously about his family and his upbringing and everything, and how close he was with his parents and his grandparents. And, you know, what, I guess what led you to making his family kind of a homeschooling family. They're almost Luddite, in nature, like that he didn't even discover the transporter until he was, adolescent or, teenager or something. And, why that, and keeping New Orleans so grounded, in kind of the old school, I guess.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. Casey, that's a great question. Well, two reasons. One is Benjamin Sisko is such a balanced character, and part of my challenge was this man is so balanced when we meet him. I mean, when we meet him, he has the trauma of the murder of his wife, but once he gets over that, we have a pretty balanced captain. He has the work-life balance. He treats his people good. He's a father. I'm like, where did all that come from? Where did he get that from? So my job was to kind of reverse engineer all that and look backwards and say, where does that all come from? And think about what the standing on the shoulders of the writers of Deep Space Nine, which left me a plethora of great material, and think about, how to reverse engineer that. And then in writing his autobiography, I'm not just writing his, I'm writing his family's, I'm writing a biography of New Orleans. I'm writing, Joseph's, his father's. And Joseph is a unique character in Star Trek because, he doesn't like the transporters. He doesn't like replicators. He doesn't like these things. He doesn't gravitate to those things. And I thought a lot about that. And I was like, well, why doesn't he? It may have been interesting to see on screen, but if I didn't explain that, then Joseph starts to become a caricature in the book. If I just continue that theme, but without explaining it, it's like, well, why? Right? And so I have to explain that. And so then that really opened up New Orleans for me. That opened up a way to talk about the African-American experience. And Joseph has a certain amount of trauma that his family is holding, from more than 400 or 500 years, so, and Ben has to kind of break that trauma, by saying, I'm leaving Earth, and so there's a lot that I thought about, and I used the characters that were beautifully created, and try to reverse engineer them to give me answers and look at them in ways that I thought that would unfold organically in the autobiography. I hope that answers the question. Yeah.
No, I think that's great because, as you were writing the book, and I can just sense this, is because as I was reading it, I was thinking this just makes so much sense that there would be places on Earth that would, because, Earth has become this, metropolis for the universe because of Starfleet, that would hold on specifically to very, human things, right? And so to have, New Orleans be one of those cities I felt very authentic, to New Orleans. You could imagine different cities, in, say, maybe like a Japan doing the same thing, or a China, or, somewhere in Europe really kind of holding on to those, very specific European thing, So you can really feel like why this would be the case, that there would be people who would not want to forget Earth history and Earth culture, because... And that there would be cities that would be dedicated to that because they felt very strongly about it. And you didn't want to lose that part of your identity, even though you were a part of this grander identity, as the Starfleet or the Federation or any of those things.
Right. And you're exactly right. And I think with Star Trek, what we've seen a lot is we've seen a lot of Star Trek from the point of view of course, the Federation, Starfleet, and we've seen a lot of the clean lines, a lot of the newness, a lot of the technology, and just thinking about this. First of all, I've never been to New Orleans, so I had to do like my first 2 weeks before writing anything. I just sat and I watched some documentaries on New Orleans. I like documentaries. I read a couple books. I watched the HBO show Treme, which is a phenomenal show, and really gave me some insights, And so I started thinking about, and it's funny you mentioned Japan. 'Cause I thought about Japan as well. I did think about China. I thought about places that were deeply rooted in human culture, and New Orleans is one of those. Louisiana is one of those, but also what's interesting about New Orleans is that, it's basically even today, but today I'm thinking of like the future. It's a service industry town. A lot of it is that's how its economy grows. And so what happens when that just all pivots and money is not used anymore? When you have replicators and holodecks and you say, you don't need gumbo, you don't need these things anymore. And people have been doing this, and their families have been doing this. And all of this culture is just, these people aren't going to let go of those things. We don't let go of it in our own families. My mom, I buy my mom an iPad. She's like, yeah, that's nice. And then she still watches, her TV that she's had for years, People don't do that. That's not the human experience. The human experience is we gradually do these things, And so I'm trying to, the beautiful thing about Star Trek is that it's always felt real to me. And I think it's real to show that some people are just going to say, nah, no thanks, and I think a fair humanity and a fair human government would be like, okay, we're not going to force you, okay, and in that, find that in that preservation, that's a beautiful thing. That's not a bad thing, and that's why I think New Orleans, when we see it, those clips of it, when we see it on Deep Space Nine, it still has that, you can still have that, and then that helped me when it came to writing jazz in the book and talking about jazz. It all started to unfold and make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I think that I was thinking about how well you had done this, because it connects very well to who Dr. McCoy is as a character, because basically he's kind of a representation of that attitude in some ways. Like, he's begrudgingly part of Starfleet, he's begrudgingly, but he still likes his real bourbon, he still likes his real alcohol. Forget that synthahol crap, and there are a few characters. I mean, Scotty's one of those characters too in the original series, right? Mm-hmm. And so this, I think it just was a great understanding of, and when you were talking about the idea of like figuring out why Sisko is such a kind of balanced person who is also kind of able to, in many ways, I think, come in and accept the situation as it is on Bajor, but also trying to make it better. Like, this is the type of person who would be able to do that, because, yeah, he spent most of his life without the major modern conveniences. And so you send this dude that's got that personality to Bajor.
Right. That's exactly, and that's why I spent so long in his childhood and in that, because I was thinking, well, in my head, I was thinking the book will be like it does have like 3 acts, it has the New Orleans childhood, that whole part, and then he goes to Starfleet, but the New Orleans, the whole family section carries through to Starfleet, and everything he learns there takes him to Starfleet, and then for the second act, and then everything he learns at home and in Starfleet carries him through into the third act as an officer. But that's like our lives, right? I mean, hopefully we grow on this curve, I mean, and there are, there are hills and valleys, but hopefully we have this slope that goes up, and that's what I wanted for him. And I also thought a lot about Gene Roddenberry. I know, this wasn't something that he approved and he wasn't around for, but I always felt that Ira Stephen Bear and all the writers were very, very respectful to the premise of Star Trek and the idea of Star Trek. and what Gene Roddenberry set forth. And I felt I could do no less, So I thought a lot about what Gene Roddenberry intended. And you're right, like with McCoy rooted us in the real so that we could have the fantastic, And that was the beauty of that triumvirate of those three characters of Kirk, Spock, McCoy, right? Because McCoy always pulled Kirk back every now and then, and sometimes Spock, and he would challenge him, but he would always root us. And so I needed that New Orleans, and I needed Joseph to kind of root us. And then, Ben has that confrontation with his father where he's like, yeah, I've learned everything you taught me, but I'm not gonna stay. And so we get to see Joseph's trauma, and how that's held him back. And, because he doesn't even leave Earth, I think, until like somewhere like around fifth or sixth season of the show,
Yeah.
Which is like the first time he said he's left Earth and come to visit him on Deep Space Nine. And you think about, and I thought about that, and I was like, he's never really left Earth. Not, really. And I was like, wow, man, that's huge in the 24th century for someone that has that ability to just go and never does. So, it all had to make sense, so that's why I wrapped it all in like that.
Yeah. I felt like too, even when they went to Starfleet Academy, like, and his parents were visiting, and I got like by that point, I had this impression that even Joseph hadn't really used transporters. He preferred ground cars or the hover cars or electric cars, and like, so when he goes to visit Starfleet Academy, he's kind of begrudgingly taking the transporter because it's, so far away.
Right. I had to move. I had to slowly get Joseph moving to little things, like the family trips and stuff like that. And it's interesting, it's as much as it's Ben's story, it's other characters, it's their stories as well, because you see how Joseph was more outgoing with his family while his family was there. But then you can look now, you can see that Joseph just stayed after events in his life, after his wife's death and stuff, he's never left, right? And so certain events make sense for him as well, too.
Yeah.
So,
And one of the things that I was really enjoying, too, about this is especially during his Starfleet Academy years, there was, and I messaged Matthew about this while we were both reading it, but there's a lot of like cameos in the book, or a lot of names that come up that I kept having to be like, boy, I recognize that name, and kind of go look it up and be like, oh, that's right. And it'd be like somebody we've seen before. But, could you talk us kind of through your process of like finding those characters, the ones that were kind of there at the right time, whether it was Twyla Scott or, Geordi that shows up at one point, kind of how, that must have been really fun to be able to find a way to bring these characters in.
Yeah. Sorry for the New York sirens. I've always wanted to write Twyla Scott into something. I love the character. I think it's a character that was never really fully utilized. She was, and the actress that played her really played her to the hilt, and she was like a one and done. And I was, and so I was, before I wrote the outline for the book, I had about a few days to think about what I wanted to put in the outline, because I knew once the outline is written and improved, those were my guardrails. I couldn't really deviate. So I would spend like hours in the shower. My girlfriend's like, "What are you doing?" Like, I'm in the shower, I'm thinking, and I was like, I think the timelines line up. I think I can put Twyla in the book. And then once I started, Memory Alpha, which we all love, and I went to Memory Alpha, and I started looking, and I had, I really made sure that the timelines matched up. And I was like, I can really do something and do even more than I thought I could do. And just use her and have her impart certain things to him, and also get to tell her story at that same time. So, this book is his story, of course, but it touches on people, and you get to see moments in other people's lives, and you get to understand, hopefully, those individuals as they come in and out of his life, just like our life. When a person comes into our life, it's not always it's not. Sometimes we think it's going to be permanent. We think it's going to be forever, and it ain't. But sometimes during the time they were here, they give us something, or we give them something, and that was the reason. At least that's what I believe. That was the reason they were here, was for us to give something to them, or them to give something to us. And so that's what I that's what I did. And just to answer the question of like, was she still around? Was she still like alive and all that? I wanted to like kind of answer that question. And then for other people, there would be times I'd be writing 2, 3 in the morning, and I'm like, oh wow, yeah, I could do this. Kaczynski.
Oh, yeah.
I never liked that guy. This is a great moment. This is a great guy. I think I was because it's really weird. Like I really didn't watch any of Deep Space Nine. Once I would watch it a little bit to get like Ben's voice, and I watched Pale Moonlight. But after that, I just really didn't watch it. But I'm used to watching Trek, so Trek would be on in the background. I think the Traveler episode of Next Gen was on, and I was like, "Oh, wait a minute, that's Kaczynski. Wait a minute, this is that timeline. Can I fit Kaczynski? Can I get him in?" And then it's like if you're going to put someone in, you don't want to just have them walk across the screen. You want it to be something that is respectful to that character and makes sense and is congruent with that character, even if it's for a moment. That's what I come from a film background. So if a person's going to be on screen, then it has to be congruent and has to be meaningful for that character, right? So I was like, and that what I wrote for Kaczynski is in line with Kaczynski. It's in line with the character. So yeah, so that was a lot of fun. And then going down the line and thinking of people and writing people, Data was really a fun one. Geordi, that was really a fun chapter or scene. I wrote that. I think I wrote that after mostly everything was done, and I just wanted something a little bit extra. And it was originally supposed to be Janeway, actually, Geordi, and Riker. I realized there was a time where Janeway, Geordi, and Riker and Ben were all at the academy like for 1 year. And I was like, oh, the crisis protocol, I could do that. But then we talked about it. Titan and CBS was like, that's a little too much to put all of those people in that same room, And I was like, you know what, they're right. I agreed with that. So we rolled it back and it was just Geordi. But I think it's a nice cameo for Geordi,
Yeah.
So,
and there's no saying that those other people weren't in the room; they just weren't featured in Ben's story.
Right, and it's just right. Well, that he didn't run into them in the academy. It's just not shown, not told. And then somebody, unlike the other cameos, the ones that they made sense. Shelby made sense. I tried. It had to make sense. It wasn't just like you're throwing somebody in. Everything had to make sense. So everybody I put in made sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I think you did a great job with that. Like you were even talking about just okay. Oh, that's going to be too much, right? So we just scale it back, and it's just Geordi, and so that really, comes to life in it, and I think it feels, very real. One of the things too, we dive so much into his early life, which is so important. We were talking, Casey and I, the fact that Deep Space Nine is one of the most detailed of all the shows in what we end up knowing about characters, and yet, with Ben, we still only have a basic outline. And so I was really interested, to hear what it was like then to fill in his early career, because we only kind of know, scant information, kind of the bullet points of that. So I'd love to hear just about getting to tell the stories of what his early career was like.
Yeah, that was an interesting one, Matthew, because again, he's a challenge to write. It's in a way, it's easier to write characters that have problems, because then you can create the traumas. you know? But when someone comes to you ready-made, then it's like, well, what do I do with this, you know? So in creating his early career, I just started to touch on, I think once I really the characters also helped me because once I really came upon Tryla in the book, this idea of Ben not seeing his own potential, you know, and not seeing what everyone else sees, you know, is really interesting because it's impossible to not see that in Avery Brooks when we see that first episode, right? Image one, minute one, you see it. But to think that as a young man, he didn't see it, it kind of makes sense because that's not where he was going. That's not the trajectory, you know? So I was like, oh, wait a minute. He was going to be an engineer. He wasn't even thinking about the command track. He wasn't thinking about that, you know? So that's what helped me to go along that line where everybody else is seeing this persona that just needs a little bit to go, but he doesn't see it, you know?
Seems like that's the way a lot of us are. It's just that, you know, we set ourselves on a path and then everyone else is kind of like, what are they doing with their life? They could be doing this other thing.
Well, right, and I think that was to me, I love the way that in some ways that kind of ties to the way he was brought up, which is this kind of very hardworking, humble upbringing. And therefore, I think that's what creates in Sisko this inability to kind of see that because he's not looking at himself more than he ought. You know, he's not trying to make himself bigger or cooler or any of those things. Like he's a very honest character, like we were kind of talking about. And it takes others basically to thrust authority onto him, which is, I think, one of the things that makes him in many ways one of the most unique captains of Star Trek, in the sense that he didn't necessarily seek out captaincy. That's what he was looking for at the beginning. He wasn't even looking to be, you know, a leader. And it makes it really interesting then, of course, when, you know, in season 4, Worf comes onto the show and then he has, you know, command thrust upon him. And so I really appreciated that. I thought that you did such a great job of working through that early career to get Sisko from point A of being an engineer to be on the command track, even though that's not where he thought he wanted to go until like he realized, no, this really is my calling.
Yeah. Yeah. And also I was thinking about, I mean, you're exactly right. But also I was thinking about that self-confidence doesn't come from being a captain. It just comes from him having lived his life. So when he does step into the captaincy, it's more about him understanding and knowing who he is than anything else. That's where that core is all coming from, you know? And I think that's what makes a real strong captain. Like Kirk has that. Kirk, you know, whether he's a captain or not, he's still Kirk, right? And that's what I wanted. Whether he's a captain or not, he's always been, you know, Ben's always been a captain. You know, Kirk has always been a captain. These people are always captains. It's that individual. They just get the title. And so I wanted to show that, you know, his upbringing. And by the time he gets it, by the time, like once he's done with the academy, and I think he meets Curzon, and Curzon starts to bump against him. You start to see, you know, when he starts to like go against Curzon, you start to see that the Ben that we know, I think, starts to come out a lot more in the book, hopefully, you know.
That's, when you bringing that up, I would love for you to kind of talk about that, because I thought the way that you handled his relationship with Curzon was really well done, because we know from everything in Deep Space Nine, you know, Curzon had a lot of faults, and yet he and Ben still end up being such good friends. And so I'd love to hear you talk about kind of walking that tightrope line of writing this, you know, really difficult character to write in many ways.
Yeah, you're right. It was very difficult to write. And when I got to the Curzon chapter, I was like, okay, what am I gonna do? And I was like, well, you know, it's Curzon, right? It's Curzon, and Curzon's not a bad guy. He's just you really have to. We've seen in the show with Curzon that you have to make him respect you. He's the kind of, and I know people like that in my own life where, and I know people like that have been to war. I have a friend of mine, this guy known for a long time, and our age groups are really different. This guy's a Vietnam vet, and so he's experienced a lot more than I have, and his attitude is, well, people have to prove to me that they are deserving of my respect. And whether that's right or wrong, that's his point of view. And I felt a lot of the same thing is going on in Curzon's head. Right or wrong, you have to prove to me, and I'm going to walk all over you until you prove it to me. And once I had that, and I was like, all right, Curzon's going to walk all over him. And so he had to step up. And that was one of the first times that Ben is really it's like, oh, wow, am I really going to, have to do this with this guy? Because, this guy he's I'm a subordinate to him. But I think the way Ben handles it is really well. And once Curzon sees that he can't get one over on this kid, immediately it flips and it switches, and you can see the respect start to happen between the two of them. And we learn why Curzon is, why they call each other why he calls him the old man. And from there, I think it really starts to pick up, and Ben starts to come into his own at that point,
We had a lot of other characters too. Like I loved seeing, there was actually a couple scenes that stood out to me too with Jennifer. And it was his first meeting, and then, even before that, finding out who George is, and who he was to them. But then also seeing the scene on the Saratoga during Wolf 359, but seeing them really for the first time from the perspective as they actually happened, like from Ben's memory, rather than from the prophet's recreation, I guess, as they're trying to show him and tell him that he lives there. But, so I really enjoyed getting the context around that. And then even further than that, like, again, with all these callbacks, but he actually talks to Jake about like how he came to pick his crew for Deep Space Nine, and like something I think that we never really thought of. Like, I never really thought that, like, we know that Bashir got to he had his choice of assignments, but to really know that like Ben was the one that he picked Bashir for this, and he picked Jadzia because of Curzon, obviously. But each of these people he handpicked, I thought was just a really great way to really add to what we already knew about the characters and the story and everything, and how everyone came to be here. It really just kind of filled out everyone's story a lot better.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that was interesting to do, because I was thinking about, well, why is Ben picking these particular people? Obviously they're the best, and obviously, Curzon's and the whole, and Dax and all that, but why is he picking these people? And by that point, a lot of what I was doing, it was just, I was just in a certain zone, because it was just clear to me, everyone he's picking is single,
Oh, yeah.
and, and that's a factor that's he's thinking about, because with 359, he's over it, but it's not. And he's thinking about that. And, if I have a command structure now and something goes off, look at what just happened to me. And, and that's reality, right? You're going to be thinking about these things. So that all came to play, and of course he wants the best, and then his experiences on Starbase 137. So that plays into O'Brien, of course. So all of that. Yeah, I just started to by that point, things started to really come together. So it was almost like it was a lot of things were like propelling and writing themselves. In regards to Jennifer, it was really hard to come up with a vocation that I felt was believable and organic for Jennifer. Because at first I was like, oh, she's going to be a teacher. No, that's not good. She's going to be an architect. Oh, that's not good. And so it just didn't feel right. And I just still kept watching Emissary, and I realized that in the memory of her, she's wearing a blue bikini on a blue blanket at the beach. And then the only time he really talks about her is in this last episode of second season, Jem'Hadar, and he's camping with Jake and Quark, and they're talking about how they all went water skiing, and he's like, "Yeah, your mom taught you how to water ski," and I'm like, "Wow, the only real pure memories of Jennifer are around water," you know, and I was like, "Oh." Oh, and then it just, water, right? So she's an oceanographer, and then that opened up so much for me when I got that, so.
Well, I mean, when you take that and then, especially him going to space, her really with the ocean, I mean, you can't get a lot. I mean, they're very similar in some ways in the science, but like in other ways, they're worlds apart. But to kind of juxtapose that with his previous relationships where, with Twyla Scott, she was like, I can't be held back because of Starfleet. And then, he had other relationships like that too. And then to have him in a position where he's like, might have to make that decision again, and luckily doesn't. But, like he kind of has a pattern in his relationships like that.
Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of parallels. I try to put a lot of parallels in the book because in my life and in life, there are parallels, there are things that happen to me at 10 and at 15 that I think about now that give me insights, at the age I am now. I think that's all of us, right? So a lot of parallels and all of that, try to weave all of that in so that you can look at the parallels between Jennifer and Twyla, between like you said, his relationships and his friendships and all of those kind of things, and say, oh yeah, I can see why this is all like that.
One of the things that you give us an opportunity to get a glimpse at is his time in the Celestial Temple. As he's telling this story to Jake, and he's sending this transmission. He gets interrupted a couple of times, and so I just kind of love to hear your thought process on that, because that's the thing I think all fans are like, oh, what is it like to be in the Celestial Temple for Ben Sisko at this point? And so I would love to hear you talk about just kind of crafting those scenes.
Yeah, man, that was a little difficult, man. I mean, it was like, what's it like to be in the Celestial Temple? And I was like, oh my God, what's it like to be, And so what's so hard about that is everything we've watched on Deep Space Nine, we've watched it, right? So I'm like, how am I going to convey any of this, in a book? How am I going to do that? And so I'm like, all right. So then I just really started thinking about it. And originally it was just going to happen once. But then I was like, I can actually do more than that. I can do it more than once. And then the idea was, well, okay, it's a autobiography, so it's in first person, right? So if I break that, and go to like third, if I just break it, then the reader will automatically be jarred and be like, well, this is not right. What's happening, and it'll free me up to tell a different type of story, And so once I realized that, I'm like, oh yeah, because now I can tell a story within a story, and you can actually take those instances and look at them individually, or look at those instances, and they are telling a story, So it's and I'm asking and answering questions in those moments and those nonlinear moments, as I called them. So yeah, but that was difficult to do because it was like, and so I didn't write them for the longest time. I wrote around them and everything, and it was like, where are you going to place them? And then when I got to like to the first one, I was like, this is a good place, because I was just writing about his life, and I said the reader now is just so cemented in his life. Now it's a time to just throw a curve and be like, what? Did I miss a chapter? Is something wrong with the book? Well, what's happening? And this is a great place to put that in, and I think that worked well, because it's just dropped in, and that's how it felt for him in the Celestial Temple. It just happens, so.
Well, and I mean, too, if you think that, if Jake Sisko is technically the one writing this, he's an author himself, and
right.
Has probably some understanding of what Ben's been through. I'm sure they've talked about it at some point, but also these are transmissions that are coming to Jake from Ben anyway, so he's getting some sort of visions himself, I'm sure, as he's writing it. So, I mean, that's kind of, at least for, as I was reading it, kind of how I was interpreting that, because it was jarring, because the first one doesn't happen for quite a while into the book. Mm-hmm. And, it does, I had exactly the feeling that you were just describing. I was kind of like, wait, where am I? Okay, so now I'm in a celestial temple, but this is an autobiography. So, so it worked for, what you were going for sure.
Good. Yeah. And right. This is all also, we're reviewing what has been sent to Jake. So is Jake writing it? So, and even Jake says that there's some jarring stuff in here. So, yeah. So there's a lot going on, in this. And initially, like in the last episode, Emissary, Ben never talks to Jake. He talks to Cassidy, right?
Oh, yeah.
And he never speaks to Jake. And, that last pullback scene is Jake, looking for his father. So I wanted to kind of answer that, where, Ben, as soon as he gets to the wormhole, is sending this to Jake. But because he's now nonlinear himself, it doesn't get to Jake right away. Mm-hmm. He's still working through, it's all new to him. So it doesn't get there till a year later. And then it takes 2 years for Jake to process the material that he's got. So, so that explains things. And I'm trying to show that even though Ben is in this place, he's not a master of it. Things are still happening around him. So, yeah.
What was it for you to kind of end the book with Benny Russell? I loved that ending, because it almost in many ways allows us all to pull out, as just a reader, as to why we enjoy Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And so was that what you were going for with ending with Benny?
Yes. Yes. And one, yes. Two, there was nowhere else that I could put Benny Russell in the book. There's nowhere else I could put it. And then before doing the outline, I was like, yeah, the end, so the book has 3 beginnings and it has 2 endings, right? Because it has the Nog opening, then it has the Jake opening, and then it has Ben's opening. So it has 3 beginnings, and then, Ben ends it, but then Benny ends it as well. And so in doing that, I am saying to the reader, I mean, it's a little meta, but I'm saying to the reader, there are things that I want, hopefully, the reader to think about, not just what they've read, but about Star Trek, and why why it's still here. I mean, it's here because it's really well written, and it's a great show, and it's great effects. But it's more than that, because there are other stuff that has come and gone. And Star Trek means a lot to a lot of people. I've interviewed people, like I said, for Star Trek Magazine, and everyone tells me the same thing. Oh, I watched it with my dad. We didn't speak before that, but we would watch it every week. Oh, they would always come back to family and personal stories, and so there was no way I could not end it in that way.
Well, and it gives hope to the Benny storyline as well, because in Far Beyond the Stars, he's a struggling writer and can't get himself published. Nobody wants to buy this Deep Space Nine story. And then with your story here, we're ending with Benny Russell on the 30th anniversary of the publication of his story, which, I mean, obviously, parallels with 30-year anniversary of our Star Trek Deep Space Nine. But it's really cool then to like think about the Benny character as a successful writer, later in life too.
Right. He's much older, but he's still cracking at it, and he's still stuck with it.
Yeah.
So it's a lot to say. There's a lot going on, even in that one page. Yeah, absolutely. So that was the intent. That was the intent. And I'm glad that conveyed in that page.
No, I think it worked, and it left me in a place where, as a huge fan of Deep Space Nine, it gave voice, to how I felt as the fan, and I thought that really worked. So I got one question that's just kind of been percolating in my mind, and I thought this might be kind of a fun one to end on, but like, obviously you don't get the opportunity to bring Sisko back from the Celestial Temple. And so just for you as an author, would that be something you would want to be able to do one day? And is it something you would even want to see? Or do you think it's just a story that's better left untold, actually?
Well, honestly, I know that in Trek literature, he was brought back. He came back from the Celestial Temple. If Benjamin Sisko ever came back, I would love to see it on screen, because that's the place to happen for me. If it doesn't happen on screen, it isn't, at this point for me personally, it doesn't have to necessarily happen on screen. But I do think there are still questions that need to be answered on screen. What's going on with Deep Space Nine? And we kind of got a little bit of that with Lower Decks, but what's going on with Deep Space Nine? What about Jake? Jake is 50% profit. What's going on with Jake? These are things that I want to know. These are things that I think can and should be asked and answered. But I know Ira Stephen Bear says that he feels that I started to say Benny Sisko, that the Benjamin Sisko storyline is ended. And I can understand that. But that doesn't mean that the Sisko story needs to end. There's in one of those nonlinear moments, the prophet says to Sarah says to Ben, the Sisko still has many tasks. She's not necessarily talking about Ben. So I'll just leave that at that.
All I have to say to that is, wow, I hadn't really thought of that, but Star Trek Sisko could be a Jake Sisko story or a somebody else Sisko.
Because they're nonlinear, right? Yeah. So for her, I thought a lot about like the prophets and the way they think, and the Sisko could mean lots of different things, and so you can look at those three scenes that I wrote, and you can get a lot from that, because it doesn't have to be Ben. You still have Jake Sisko, and he's part prophet. He is legit part prophet. It's in his DNA. So there's still many tasks out there. So. Yeah,
that's a great point. So, well, one, Derek, appreciate you joining us. So much fun, as always, to get to pick the brains of the authors of Star Trek books. And so thank you for the book and everything too. But as always, let everybody know, where can people find you and follow you, and of course, see what you've got coming up. Obviously, we'll be releasing this the day that the book is dropped, so everybody can listen to it. So yeah, let people know where they can pick up a copy of this and what else you might have coming up down the road.
Thank you very much, Matthew. I really enjoyed this conversation. I could go on with you guys for hours.
Go ahead.
Oh, so could we.
Right. It was really, really great conversation. The book drops next Tuesday, a week from today, November 21st. It's available pretty much worldwide, anywhere that you purchase books. It could be pre-ordered now. I say pre-order and you'll get it sent to your house. That's the easiest way, I think, or if you want to go to a bookstore, you might want to call and find out if they're gonna carry it. Most will, but you want to make sure before you go. As for me, I can be found at social media, Attico, Dattico, on X, Twitter or whatever it's called now. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, all those places. Attico is where you can find me. My website is derekattico.com. I'll be doing some conventions. It looks like I might be doing a con next month, and I'll be posting about that. And next year, of course, I'll be doing Shore Leave and Trek, a few Trek conventions. I'll be posting all about that, and I'll be writing as much as possible, and some stuff I'm working on, but nothing I can really talk about. And hopefully, I don't know if I'll be doing any Trek stuff next year. We'll see. But I'm happy to talk to anybody on social media if they just give me a shout out at Attico. Awesome.
Well, again, as always, it's always a pleasure for us to be able to get the time of the authors, and so thank you for spending time with us. And I really do, in all honesty, I hope everybody will pick up this book. As a huge Deep Space Nine fan, it's a joy to read, and it seems like, perfect gift for the holidays.
Absolutely.
It's yeah, right. I mean, Thanksgiving is it comes out on the 21st. Thanksgiving is that same week. Christmas is right after, and you can any form of Trek, any Trek that you like. I got something for everybody in there, as you guys can probably attest to. There's lots of different Trek in there, not just Deep Space Nine. So, there's a lot of Easter eggs and cameos in the book. So, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Derek. This has been great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both, Casey and Matthew. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well, it's always great to get a chance to meet with an author of our favorite Star Trek books. It's an honor to have them, really, and I'm glad that we've gotten a chance to talk to Derek about this one, the Autobiography of Sisko, because, I'm sure we've mentioned numerous times that we've both been looking forward to this one for a long time. So, I look forward to see what Derek's got coming in the future, and, would love to see more Star Trek from him.
Yeah. And it's so interesting too, because I feel like, whereas so many of these autobiographies are, you already know the entire story, and yet I feel like with Sisko, there's just so much we don't know about him as a character, even though we spent 7 years with him. And I think Derek did such a phenomenal job of filling in all of those time periods we didn't know anything about, really, that were only hinted at in the series. And that's exactly what you would want from this. And I mean, I think, like you, Casey, this is a book that I absolutely loved, and could not recommend it more to everybody, especially as we hit the holiday season here. If you're needing Christmas gifts or whatnot for somebody and they're a Star Trek fan, there you go. You got this, and you got the making of Star Trek 2. So
yeah, it's a lot that came out this year.
Awesome. Well, hey, if anybody wants to catch up with you, Casey, where might they find you and see what else you've got going on?
Yeah, you can find me on Goodreads, Letterboxd, Twitter, and Instagram at Knitting Trekkie. And then you can also find me poking around on Facebook in the Babel Conference.
And of course, you can find me all over social media under the name Matt Rushing02. You can also find me here on the network doing a bunch of other shows. Of course, the 602 Club, talking about all of our franchises we love outside of Star Trek. Then Literary, then The Orb, Warp 5, Saddle Up, and The Artificial Tango. You can also find me over on the Nerd Party Network with a couple of shows. One's completed, called Owl Post, talking about every single chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time. And Aggressive Negotiations with John Mills. We're talking about Star Wars each and every week. But, as always, thank you so much for joining us. And until next time, live long
and read on.
What do you call that, light reading? To each his own, number one.